So in this video, we're going to show you the steps that you'll be taking to turn your skirt block into a panel skirt. So this is the design of the skirt. There's no center front seam. Instead we have these side front seams running down here. We have the side seam, and this is on the front of the skirt, and we have a waistband up here. On the back of the skirt we don't have these panel lines. We have a single line down the center back. We have 2 patch pockets and 2 darts ending underneath the patch pockets. Here you can see we have a button with an extension underneath it in the waistband, and this little marking to indicate that there's an invisible zipper. Down here you can see that we have a 3 or 4 centimeter hem that is finished with top stitching. So we do an analysis of our design. We have a look at the block and then decide what changes we need to make to the block to get to this design. So first of all, we're going to shorten the block by 15 centimeters. So shortening the front and the back. Measuring up from the hem, 15. I will use pencil for this bit, so I'm not marking my block permanently with pen. So 15 centimeters here, 15 centimeters here, and then connecting those 2 points across. Now, to create this line extending from the waist all the way down to the hem, we're going to draw a right angle line from the hem up to the end of the dart here. So there's a couple of ways that we can do that. If you have your right angle ruler to hand, you can place that along your new hemline. Make sure that's in line, and then move it over so that it connects to the end of the dart, and then rule that line in like that. If you don't have one of these, you can very simply measure from the end of the dart to the center front of the block, which on mine is about 10.6. So then I transfer this information down here, 10.6, and mark the end. So either technique you can use. What you want to finish with is a parallel line down here from the end of the dart. Okay, now we have the position of our center front and side front seams for the skirt design, and we can start by tracing off this center front panel. I've got my paper on a fold, so when we're turning our block into a pattern, we need to make sure that our pattern is complete and not on the fold anymore. So I'm placing the center front onto the fold of the paper so that it's right in line. So I've got the center front lined up, and I'm placing a weight on so that it doesn't move around while I'm tracing it. Now I'm going to use my tracing wheel to trace along here, up, across this top section, and then I'm going to trace from the end of the dart to the waist. I know this is a straight line, so I don't need to trace all the way along. I can just trace from here to the end of the dart. Now I'm going to mark the end of the dart in with a little cross like that, and then I'm going to continue up this side of the arm of the dart like that. And this top section I can use my pen to trace. Now I'm going to use a pen to do my pattern making here, just so that it's easier for you guys to see. When you're at home or you're in class, you'll always be using a pacer or a pencil. Okay. Now it's a little bit hard, so I'll mark the dotted lines that I have. This is the end of the dart. the hem, and then coming across. Now using a ruler, so I'm keeping my lines nice and straight, connecting the dots. This will be our center front panel. Center front. We'll be putting our 3 centimeter hem and our 12 millimeters seam allowance around it for the moment. I'm going to leave it and move on. So we've created this one and we're going to move on to the side panel. So we've traced the center. Now I'm going to place the side panel over here. Making sure that when you're tracing onto paper, you're not cutting out a huge piece of paper and just using a little corner of it and then throwing the rest in the bin. Be mindful when you're pattern making, when you're using resources, that you're not using more than you need. But do make sure you have enough. So with the paper, you want to make sure that when you're tracing, you have enough space around the edge to add your seam allowance and your hem allowance, or if there are any other changes that you're doing. So I've got my weight on so that it doesn't move around. Now I'm going to trace up this part of the dart arm. So I'm starting with the waist now, marking that notch, tracing to the side seam. When you're tracing, don't forget to mark your notches, and coming down to the new hemline here, tracing along this hem, up to the end of the dart, marking across in the same position that I marked over here, and then extending up to the waist. Okay. Now again, I'm connecting the dots. We have our center front fold to indicate the center front, which is the grain line on our front panel. Over here, we know that this line is parallel with our center front. So to get the grain line, I can place the grading ruler along that line and then transfer. Okay, I'm going to now add my seam allowances and my labeling to these two pieces. So we'll put a 3 centimeter hem on the bottom, $12mm seam allowance all the way around. So as you can see, I'm using my grading ruler. I've got the line, the stitching line here on my 12mm line on the ruler, and then connecting these junctions. Now here, where the end of the dart is, there's a little angle. Rather than following that angle exactly, I'm going to smooth it so there's no bump on that line when we stitch these two seams together. And here, 12 mils across the waist. Now we'll put our seam allowance and hem allowance along our side panel. Three centimeters on the hem, 12 millimeters on the side seam. As you can see, I'm moving the ruler so that it follows the line of the skirt, and you do short lines to create that curve around the edge, and then when you have a long flat section, you can simply transfer it across like that. 12 millimeters up here on the waist. Again, there's a very gentle curve, making sure that you don't flatten your pattern pieces out when you transfer them or when you add your seam allowance, but that you follow that curve. And we'll do the same thing on this side to smooth the little bump where the end of the dart was. So just flattening that out a little bit. Now to transfer the notches, we're going to make sure we have all of our information correctly transferred. I'm going to extend some of the seam lines into the seam allowance so that we get the correct positions for our notching and the correct direction for the notches as well. Doing this will also help you when you're sewing, making sure that your seam allowances are extended correctly. Okay. Next, I'm going to cut out the center front before I finish the labeling and the notching. Because it's 2 pieces of paper folded, I'm popping in a couple of pins so that it doesn't move around, and this will help ensure that my pattern will remain symmetrical when I cut it out. Cutting with nice long strokes, try and avoid getting those little jagged bits on the end. Use your other hand to stabilize the paper or the fabric as you're cutting. And I'll make sure when you're doing a symmetrical pattern piece that's on the fold, you need to make sure all of the information you need is transferred to the other side as well. So I'm going to use that center front fold to place my grain line. And there will also include a notch on the center front as well. Now I'm going to mark on the seam allowances where they're joining on the other side. So it's helpful for you when you're sewing and pattern making to mark the junctions of the seam allowances or the positions where you have a notch. The labeling on this one will be name, garment, so we'll call this the panel skirt, and the center front panel. Now the cutting instruction for this one, if we refer back to the design, you'll see there's only one of these. So we can say cut one self, and circle. It's the size 10. And I'm going to leave the numbering till right at the end to make sure that I've completed all my pattern pieces, and so I get that number correct. Now I'll be notching this one. To notch a single layer of paper can be a little bit tricky, so I recommend either using another little bit of paper or a piece of card so that the notches can go through the paper without sort of chewing it up too much. So I'll start at the center front. Then I'll work around in a clockwise. So I'm going to do this seam down here, my hip notch, and I'm coming down to the hem. I will do both sides of the hem because that helps the machinist to fold the fabric up accurately when they're turning the hem. Also, the distance between the hem and the end of the garment means that I can safely put another notch here without worrying about it tearing off this corner, because there's a far enough distance between these two notches. So I've notched up this seam. I'm going to notch my hip notch over here, and now I'm one notch for this waist seam across the top here. Okay, I can cut out and notch my side front panel. Okay, doing my notching. I'm going to start up here and then work around. So this notch is for this seam, this notch is for this seam down here. This is the hip notch and the hem. Now for this seam up here. The other side of the hem. And this is the end of the original dart. And when we sew these two together, we need to make sure that even though we haven't done any alterations to this area, we just want to double check that this line is still matching and that our notch is in the right position. So if I hold that to that point, I can see that that's working nicely and that our hem notches are matching as well. So I'm really happy with that. So that's called checking the flow through of your pattern. What we have done, the change that we have created with our block, is we've eliminated this dart value. The dart has now disappeared, and instead we've turned it into a shaping that is appearing on this seam down the center front. Now for the labeling, name, panel skirt, side front. This pattern piece, you can see, appears here and here. It's symmetrical, so each of those pattern pieces, this one will be cut one side and then this is cut the other side of the fabric. So we can write this cutting instruction as cut one pair self. Cut one pair self. Circle the instruction, size 10, and we'll leave the numbering for later.